Hey everybody, welcome back to a new episode of Psychedelic. I am your host. I am your fearless leader, your pineal gland of liberty, your freedom chakra aligner, your third eye of libertarian psychedelia. Welcome back to the show, or welcome for the first time to the show. To Psychedelic. This is a podcast where we try and explore all kinds of big ideas, all kinds of topics in our world with a psychedelic perspective, with a psychedelic mindedness about it, and a focus, a core focus of cognitive liberty, cognitive freedom, the ability to own your own mind and to alter your consciousness in whichever way you choose. We are all sovereign adults, and we deserve to have the right to put whatever we will into our body and alter our minds in whichever way we choose. All right, that's my little mini manifesto right from the get-go. But also, it's very important to have education about this stuff. It's very important to do your research and learn. You know, I didn't get to where I am now not having read up and researched on all this stuff, because they sure as hell don't teach you this in school, you know. And as we're gonna find out today, we're gonna go to school. We're gonna go to a classroom where they are teaching us this kind of stuff, where they're teaching us the important stuff. So today we have very special guest Seth Fitzgerald from The Drug Classroom, TDC. The Drug Classroom. Seth makes tremendous amounts of videos that dive deep into drug education from a non-biased point of view, free from propaganda, just straightforward, great information, great videos. You know, his view is, look, people are going to do drugs no matter what. We've always been a part of, it's been a part of our culture, it's been a part of our history. It's not going anywhere, so we might as well properly educate people so they don't make terrible mistakes when it comes to this stuff, or at least so they have an option, to learn in the right way. You know, put the information out there. So if somebody is going to get themselves involved in doing something, that they can at least be informed of what they're doing. So this is a much-needed service, and I'm very excited about today's episode. And I think we had a really great conversation. We went from everywhere. We talked about drugs, to drug policy, to society and culture, to history, and to the principles of liberty, and what maybe the future will hold. Seth's a really smart guy, and I'll put all the links in the show notes. We talk about where you can find him, but it's thedrugclassroom.com, and he's got a tremendous wealth of information out there, educating people and educating his peers really on drugs and the use of drugs and their full implications, a full comprehensive scope of these things. So, before we get into the conversation, I just want to say thank you, everybody, for your love and your support and just your overall awesomeness. I really try and create a podcast here where we can talk about just a wide variety of different things, and hopefully we have interesting conversations. I think I do a pretty good job of making that happen. So thank you all for your feedback. It does not go unnoticed. I love to hear feedback from people, honest feedback. You know, if you guys, if you like the show, if you think I'm doing a good job or a bad job, message me, contact me. We'll talk. It's great. And I want to give a special shout out, of course, to my patrons who make this all possible. I just launched a Patreon campaign, and it's in its infancy. I haven't really marketed it so much yet. But if you guys feel compelled to help out and support the show, I would really, I would make sweet love to all of you individually. I would come to your house, and we would just do it any way that you want. But seriously, thank you to all the patrons. Special shout out to Vincent, Jeff, Liam, William, and Ben, and Rob. You guys, and the Dope Show, of course, which is a great great program that had me on recently. So these guys are the first bunch of people to donate and to come on board and to support my work. So I'm forever grateful to you guys. Thank you very much. And hopefully we can get more people going. And hey, look, if you don't have the financial means to contribute, get the fuck out of here. Shut the podcast off. No, I'm just kidding. If you, obviously, I'm just kidding. That's not what we're about over here. We're about giving this out to people for free, of course. But for those of you who feel like you can't contribute, that's cool. Don't worry about it. But if you in any way that you can contribute, whether it's just sharing the episodes with friends, telling people about it, word of mouth, that does a really good job. Just liking it and sharing it and that sort of stuff, that's really good. And then if you can, just go pick up your phone, go to the podcast app, search for Psychedelic, and just leave me a little rating and review in the iTunes section. That really helps. That's kind of the way, that's podcast currency right there, ratings and reviews. So if you can help in that way, that would be great. And even if you're just a lazy bum piece of shit and you're just listening to these podcasts and you're not doing any of that stuff, I don't care. At least you're listening. I love it. So, talk about it. Do whatever you got to do. But just know that as long as you're supporting me, I love you and you better love me back. All right. All right. I think that's about it. Yeah, I really think that this episode is really great. I really enjoy the work that Seth's doing with the drug classroom. I think that we need more people out there like him that are pushing for. Oh, you know what I wanted to do? I want to play because in the beginning of the podcast, I mentioned to Seth about this video that I just happened to catch. I was scrolling down Facebook, and I just saw a video from the Drug Policy Alliance, Ethan Nadelman, talking about drug education and what we can do. And I thought, wow, isn't this perfect? I'm just about to have this conversation with Seth about drug education, and here I stumble upon this video. So I'm going to play this for you, and then we're going to lead right into the conversation. Thank you so much for your support. Hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did. And sit back and enjoy.
We are the history, and we are the future. I think if it's one thing that I ask of all of you, it is to learn, to keep learning, to learn and learn, to keep your ears and your hearts and your minds open, to read and watch and to listen deeply, to stay open to the possibility of continually growing and changing, to understand that what brings you to this conference and to drug policy reform in the first place, that what brought you is just a part of something so much greater and so much larger. That for most of you coming from America, hearing what is happening around the rest of the world, both that is inspiring as well as that is terrifying, that is our struggle as well. That for those of you who come here because of the issues and the problems of mass incarceration we deal with, understanding the incarceration that operates around the world, understanding all the other harms of the drug war, understanding the rights of people to use drugs without being persecuted for doing so, not to be demonized, not to be left for dead, to be given a helping hand. That's our mutual obligation, to keep learning, and then, as you learn, to teach what you learn. To teach what you learn. I am overwhelmingly committed to the notion that this is not a place where we preach to the converted, but where a small group of people come together so that we can become empowered to become ever more powerful agents out in the world. That we come here with the ability to go out and teach people who have never thought or cared about this stuff, of people who operate from ignorance and fear. That obligation to learn deeply and then to teach what we know, not to be an echo chamber in this little hotel room, but to go when we go into the South, into the South with the highest incarceration rates in the world 2 years from now, we will be more successful and more welcome to the extent by which we teach what we have learned. We cannot suffice about just talking to one another. Every one of you know that. We have to be willing to talk to those people we don't like, who don't look like us, who don't sound like us, and who don't vote like us. But that is how we're going to move to the next level. You know, these are... These are, as always, and they will probably always be, challenging times. You know, we look at what happened in Paris just a few days ago, and we can see the ways in which evil and terror lurk in this world, and in which we will never, ever be free of that. It's how we manage it. We look at the people in our government and elsewhere, and the people running office who want to respond to that sort of terror and evil in all the wrong ways by expelling and punishing those people who are fleeing that very terror. And that's not right. We see people doing with their fears today, and politicians taking advantage of those fears today, just what politicians and others did with the fears around drugs in the past. And that's why our struggle is not just about ending the war on drugs in America, not just about ending the war on drugs around the world. It is about taking the values of science, compassion, health, and human rights, of fighting against racism and classism and subjugation, against ignorance and fear, and taking those values to advance more closely to a civilized way of dealing with drugs and to a more civilized world altogether. In that respect, I am going to keep fighting as long as I can. Drug Policy Alliance is going to keep fighting. The organizations who join us here are going to keep fighting. I am counting on all of you to keep fighting. We are not going to stop. We're going to get bigger. We're going to get stronger. We are going to not let our internal conflicts ever tear us apart, because we have a commitment as a movement to freedom and justice. Thank you very, very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Psychedelics are illegal not because a loving government is concerned that you may jump out of a third-story window. Psychedelics are illegal because they dissolve opinion structures and culturally laid down models of behavior and information processing. They open you up to the possibility that everything you know is wrong.
We don't need new laws that control our consciousness and rigidly place it in a prison.
Cognitive liberty. The fact that as adults, if we're not hurting anybody else, we should have the right to explore the contours of our own consciousness without any mediation or legislation on the part of somebody else.
Reject authority. Authority is a lie.
Or is it perception?
Information is power, but we have to seize the opportunity. The opportunity.
Seth Fitzgerald from the drug classroom, the teacher of the drug classroom. You know, I wish I was in a school where they had a class to educate me on drugs like you've been doing so well, Seth. So please introduce yourself to people here on the podcast. You are, as I mentioned, from the drug classroom, but you also have a podcast, the Addicted podcast, that you also co-host as well. And welcome to Psychedelic.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So, yeah, I run the Drug Classroom. It's a online drug education resource. So it's mainly based around videos, and I do some written stuff as well. And you can find all that on thedrugclassroom.com. And basically the goal is recognizing that drug use exists. It's probably not going to go away no matter what the legal system does about it. And harm reduction should really be the focus, and the only way for anybody to use any drug safely is if they understand how the drug works, what the dose is, what you don't combine it with, and things like that. And that's my focus with the drug classroom.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're doing a much-needed service to humanity, and I applaud you for that. And, you know, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the show. You know, it's funny, I was just watching an old video from Drug Policy Alliance, Ethan Nadelman's closing remarks from the 2015 International Drug Policy Reform Conference, where he's urging people, look, like, let's educate people. Let's get the education out there. Let's educate ourselves, and let's not, you know, hoard that education, but let's share that education with all kinds of people. Because like you said, people are doing this stuff no matter what. We might as well provide them with the education. At least they have an option to choose to be educated about it if they would like to be. So I think what you're doing is absolutely fantastic. I think you're making some really tremendous videos, you know, from everything from nitrous oxide to DMT and everything in between. So it's modafinil and everything that you could imagine. Seth makes these very informative videos about on the drugclassroom.com, and his videos are also up on YouTube. So I just want to, you know, give my applause to you for doing that,
thank you.
For providing people with the much needed education. Yeah, and so let's talk a little bit about that. Where did this come from? What was your inspiration? What was your influence? What was your kind of drive to say, you know what, I got to do this. I got to make these videos. What was your inspiration for this?
Yeah, over time, the project has changed a bit. In the more recent period, 2015, 2016 and on, it's been sort of a clear goal of improving drug education. Hopefully that can extend into formal settings, so it's not just online. And so I have a sort of a clear intention of trying to increase drug safety and things of that sort. It actually started in about 2014, and then it was really just a random project stemming from a long-running interest in drugs, basically the longest interest I've had. And I just noticed that, I mean, there are good resources, like Heroin is the primary one,
mm-hmm.
and there's sort of a gap to fill in terms of the video format, and then having somebody who could also answer questions directly. So Heroin is sort of, if you can, you know, look through the information on your own and figure it out. But if a lot of times people have questions and they like hearing something specific to their situation, and that's sort of another side of TDC. And so it just kind of, you know, the goal of filling a little niche in that area, because there is a severe lack of drug education. I mean, even once you start browsing drug-related communities online, you notice that even the people who are into drugs to that degree often have a lot of misconceptions about different substances, and it's clear that people are not truly informed. So anything I could personally do to try and spread information and encourage discussion, and then also hopefully get people to realize that the majority of drugs can be used in a safe way. There's not just always safe drugs and then always harmful drugs like people like to suggest. You know, you have heroin on one side and cannabis on the other. I don't think it's a spectrum. And even on the end of things like heroin or methamphetamine, people use them, and there is a way to reduce the harm. So really, education is vital, and there's not a ton of resources available for it.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and you know, good on you for seeing that disconnect and then kind of, you know, capitalizing on it to bring people something that's much needed, that was missing from that. I know what you're talking about. You know, I go on Heroin a lot, and or I have gone on Heroin a lot, and you do have to kind of put a lot of the pieces together, and it is a little bit more of a kind of DIY. But with, like you said, with the drug classroom, TDC, as you mentioned, it provides with a video experience experience. I really like it because it's kind of just very straightforward, very informative, very to the point, very clear, and jam-packed with information, and they're comprehensive videos. So some of these videos are about 20 minutes long. I was just watching one on nitrous oxide, 20-minute video on nitrous oxide. I mean, that is great because, most people would overlook something like that and think it's not worth the time or effort, but it totally is, because you're providing this much needed education in that space. You said that drugs had been something that you were interested in for a long time, your longest interest. Where did that come from? How did that start? What piqued your interest about them to begin with?
Originally, it was a sort of silly childhood interest that was just kind of thinking it was cool, like seeing people when I was 11 or something, and people using cannabis, and it was just, oh, that's fascinating, but fascinating somehow to me more than everybody else. So I always was kind of like focused on that topic. And then by 13, 14, there was a bigger focus on psychedelics and sort of entering into that realm of information. So encountering Arrowwood, encountering McKenna and Leary, and just sort of learning in that sense. And so there's been different stages. And initially it was just not a clear, useful interest, but then it became the psychedelic stuff. And now, since, for the past 2-3 years, it's really been focused on the science and the history and a more formal way of looking at them, because it's gotten to the point where I just find every drug to be truly interesting. They all come, at least older drugs, all come with very unique histories, and you can learn a lot about societies through researching them. And then on the effect side, once you've experienced different drugs or just understand the different things that can come from them, the fact that certain experiences are possible with single molecules is fascinating in and of itself. So it's been this sort of progression and fascination with them. I'm not sure what initially sparked the curiosity, but luckily it transformed into something that I think is useful, and definitely a different place than I was when I was just a kid interested in the idea of using drugs.
Yeah, so I think I could definitely relate to that. When you're younger and you're seeing this kind of culture of cool maybe surrounding these things, and for me it was maybe like music of the 70s and kind of that kind of stuff, and looking back at that with reverence and awe, and just saying like, wow, there must be something to this stuff. But at the same time, I'm going to school, and briefly, like, they're mentioning, don't do drugs, or they're having the DARE program come in, or they're telling us scare stories about, things like that. And I think the information is definitely not as objective as one would want from a school. Did you experience that as well in your schooling?
Yeah, the drug education that schooling started to provide was around middle school. I remember it in maybe like 6th grade to 8th, and in that range. And it was really the same as what I ended up encountering in high school as well. It's very focused on similar to sex ed, although sex ed is a little bit better in the sense of just focusing on, here are the possible negatives of drugs, and therefore the reason not to use them. So technically, in some cases, it is providing half of the story, but the other half of the story about what benefits a person could get from different drugs, whether it's recreational or religious or medical, or the fact that although there are the harms, there was no talk about the fact that you could actually reduce them. It was just, and even to this day, when you talk to a lot of people, even in the drug community, a substance like heroin will be approached as this inherently dangerous substance, not recognizing the fact that 99% of people, you would have to have heroin is almost always going to be safe at a common dose. And that's not something that people tend to understand. So there was this, maybe 10% of the topic was being provided in the school setting, and it was in such a way that it is so clearly biased and agenda driven. I mean, that's why you have, in my case, it was mainly teachers who were providing the info, but in other cases throughout the years, you've had police officers providing education. And I remember during high school, there was some, I don't know, like a former basketball player, I don't know, on the pro or the sort of college level, who got into drugs and had, one of those general sob stories. And it's, unfortunate what happened to him. But the fact that he came to our school to give this hour talk and answer questions, even that was so clear, what the message was. And it was, don't do them because this could be you. And, not recognizing all of the other factors that exist, and especially not recognizing that although that kind of messaging might work for keeping a tiny portion of people from using drugs, everybody else is going to keep using them, but you missed the opportunity to give them good information about how to stay safe. And that's, that was really, even as somebody who's in a better school or was in a better school system for drug education, it was still that kind of rhetoric. So I can only imagine how it is in some places compared to what I experienced.
Yeah, it's the fear-based model, that they use, and scare tactics and fear, hysteria, paranoia. And like you said, there might be good reason to have that a part of the conversation, but in a more objective way, in a more non-biased way, and in a way that I think that you're doing by providing a full scope, a comprehensive view of each kind of substance or drug that you feel.
And I really think that I think if you, and I've felt this way for a while, that if you were to be viewed as a trustworthy source of info, which is also a problem when a teacher is telling you something you just know is false and then you don't listen to them anymore on the topic. If you were to be viewed as a truly good source of information, there was not a stigma about drug use in general, and you just went through and provided the pros and cons of different substances, people would, I'm very much inclined to believe, inherently navigate towards the ones that you have outlined as being less risky than others. And so people could make that choice on their own. You don't have to force them. I mean, if a certain drug is truly that bad and people trust what you're telling them, the chance is they're probably going to choose one of the other 30 substances that they could use instead of that one. And that, though, is kind of missed as an opportunity. I mean, definitely under prohibition, but also when the second you are providing false information, people start to tune out. And I know I did. And, well, in my case, I tuned out and also tried to challenge the teachers, but that doesn't really get anywhere. So it's a totally unproductive way of going about things. And I think it's very important to always talk about the risks. I mean, whether it's cannabis or cocaine, I mean, you have to discuss the reasons why, maybe this drug is safe on a monthly basis or a weekly basis, but you can't do it every day. Or this is something you should only use every few months, like MDMA. And so talk about, which settings a certain drug is safe. And then once you get outside of that setting, you encounter some risks. And if it's just laid out in that way, and you also, as an educator, present yourself as, hey, if you have questions or you're using drugs or know people who are, then you can actually come and talk. And the fact that, you admitted to using them is not going to be a legal or a school issue. You can create a dialogue and people can work through the drug issue together. It doesn't have to be as malignant in society as people view it to be.
Right. Right. It doesn't have to have all of this negative association attached to it if it was more upfront, open, and honest. And like you said, you mentioned the prohibition, right? So that's a real challenge as well, because automatically people have this false equivalency that, that it's illegal, so therefore it's immoral or it's impure or something like that. Which is a hard it's a hard stigma to get over for a lot of people, where I think a lot of people, maybe people who aren't in kind of our realm of thinking, might see this from the outside and say, well, this person might be, this person seems to be advocating drug use because they're talking about drugs in a positive light or just not in a negative light. And that, I just completely disagree with that, totally 100%. But let's talk a little bit about the drug policy. Have you given much thought to kind of where we are in our society right now as far as policy goes? I mean, it looks like some things are progressing, but on the other hand, who knows? In this kind of turbulent time that we're living in, do you have hope for drug policy to get better?
It seems pretty stagnant right now. I don't think that we're going to see any big positive federal shift in the near future. I have no doubt that most likely medical and recreational cannabis will continue to move through different states. And I can't picture the federal government actually preventing that from being implemented or trying to mess with it to any significant degree. Beyond that, actually, having decriminalization or legalization, I mean, that does not seem to be in the future. We probably will end up with easier access to MDMA in the relative near future. But beyond that, I mean, it's really individual drugs may have penalties lessened or access, be granted. But drugs as a whole, adopting a Portugal style, or in my opinion, what would be better is legalization. I mean, that could be a decade or more, who knows when that will occur. I definitely don't picture it happening under this administration, but also it's not in the term, when it comes to legalization, that might be something that is obvious to certain people, but the majority of citizens are not even in support of it. So it's particularly egregious when the government is inhibiting liberalization of cannabis policy because there is widespread support for it, but there isn't widespread support for legalizing heroin. So it's we also have to focus on the bottom-up change before we could really expect the government to do anything positive on the issue, because, you go to the average person and bring up prohibition on, like I said, heroin or methamphetamine, and they're not going to have the same response as they do for cannabis. And so if the government is not in favor and the people are not in favor, I'm not sure you're going to see much movement.
Right. Yeah. It is. And it is that, people do necessarily think that if you stand for all drug legalization, then that means that of course you want to see people overdosing on heroin in the streets, injecting heroin into their eyeballs, walking around with syringes all out of every orifice of their body, and and it's just simply not the case. But that's that automatic kind of fear-based response that seems to be programmed into them.
Oh, of course, and if you legalize it, then you're going to have a mass amount of teenagers using. You're going to have more crime from people stealing and breaking into stores and finding a way to fuel their drug habit. And I mean, it's assuming that, I mean, this is one of the problems too, is that the environment or the society that we currently have leads to people having a very limited view of what a drug user is like. I mean, that people think that everybody who has touched cocaine is, the worst possible cocaine addict spending $100 a day on the drug. And it's not true for any substance. And of course, you would also reduce problems as well, because if you allowed for the price to go down, I think there would be far fewer people who have their lives destroyed, even by a serious addiction, if they don't have to give up their life in order to actually afford these absurdly high-priced substances. And because there's no reason for cocaine to, cost what it does, or for cannabis to cost what it does. It's really prohibition-based. Mm-hmm. So, people assume, you would just end up with a huge amount of people engaging in the worst kind of behavior, and there truly is no statistical evidence to support it. But it's the common view of, if you say that you did methamphetamine last Wednesday, people have a lot of ideas about what's going on in your life, and they don't want that person to spread throughout society and multiply into 10% of the population. And I can understand that if those it would still be wrong, but I can understand that feeling if the notions about those people were even accurate, and they're not.
How did you know I did methamphetamine last week?
I just assumed. I looked at your feed and I saw that you had, there was a lot of activity and a lot of consecutive tweeting. So I figured
all the signs
there was some stimulant involved,
or some kind of stimulant behavior must be happening. Yeah. Well, coffee. I was on coffee. I'll admit that I was. So it seems like we have these accepted substances, that people really just don't seem to have any problem with at all. Alcohol, coffee. I would include, sugar and maybe even meat or even kind of internet, television. All people can develop sorts of addictions to all sorts of different things that influence our nervous system and that create different kinds of stimuli. Do you talk to me a little bit about that, because you're more of the expert on that than I am, but it would seem to me that it would be that there's many different ways that people can get involved in kind of things that alter their mind or their nervous system in some kind of way.
Certainly. The difference that you see between different activities are, what level of pleasure is coming from the activity, and then how immediate is that pleasure being provided, and also the other factor of if it can truly be treated as a escape from problems. So you have, different, to varying degrees, those affect different things, internet, gambling, drugs, food, etc. And so therefore you do see differences in the addiction, but the core idea of having a strong, emotional, repetitive attachment to something in the face of negative effects of that applies to a lot more than drugs. And it's not as though the drugs that people view as addictive are actually sort of entering the brain, and after 3 uses are like hijacking it and changing the person into a drug addicted zombie. There's no basis for that. Instead, they are particularly dangerous and high consequence addictions or habits, but so is certain kinds of food addiction. You can get to a point where, especially the cost to society, but also the cost to the person, is much higher from a terrible diet throughout your life than every so often, or even weekly, or even multiple times per week, using cocaine. Mm-hmm. What you will get in terms of heart disease and cancer, and cocaine is on the higher risk scale, but I don't think that you would actually, if you were to do a risk benefit analysis, actually place, constant fast food administration significantly lower on the harm scale than regular cocaine or heroin use. More so for opioids, as long as you stay safe acutely and don't use other depressants with opioids, and don't use too much, you could use opioids for basically as long as you want without severe negative effects. And that's not something that people tend to realize. Whereas if you apply that kind of tactic to a certain kind of food addiction, or especially, something like tobacco, I mean, you are on a clear course to negative effects. And so, yeah, I mean, addiction applies to all of these things, and it's influenced to, a pretty significant degree by, do you have a history of trauma? Do you have sort of any level of self-control, an ability to, have a thought pop into your head, to use something or to eat something and be able to withhold from doing that? And some people do more than others.
Mm-hmm.
And also, are you fulfilled in life? Because if you are not fulfilled, you are not happy in a genuine way, then of course a drug or a gambling or video games can come along and take over a disproportionate amount of time and have negative effects on your life. I mean, that is incredibly clear to most people when it comes to viewing things as bad habits. But once we use the term addiction, people start, applying that specifically to drugs and group it into this other category that is far more extreme and people have far less control than they do in other areas. But there's not that much support for making that distinction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's sad to see. It's almost like this terrible cycle that we keep going in, that just keeps kind of feeding itself with, people who are individually having problems in their lives. Maybe they came from their childhood or some kind of trauma or something like that, where they have to, as Dr. Gabor Mate talks about in his book about dealing with addiction, they develop these kinds of coping mechanisms, and that can be anything, and that can be heroin, that can be food, that can be whatever, and it's kind of just this thing to fill the void. But also on a societal level and like a collective level, we are in this kind of oppressive, kind of like, restrictive, prohibitionary era of the fear-based model of things. So it just seems like if people have problems, they're looking to fill their problems, and on top of that, the societal problems are crushing them. They can't get the help they need, they can't get the education they need, and then maybe it just circles around in this spiral, and we never really get to a place where we can have a full scope of a holistic approach of the entire system, from society as a whole to the individual, and then actually getting people the education and the proper kinds of settings that they need. I mean, I look at something like what Portugal is doing as a model and say that would be nice if we could have something like that here. And when I talk to maybe some friends about that, yeah, they have these safe injection centers and things like that. People automatically go, what are you, crazy? But I think that's a step in the right direction if we could at least facilitate some sort of proper way to go about this. Yeah. So what do you think about something like on in terms of this kind of cyclical nature here, and then not to also, I mean, not to go off on a total tangent, but I guess I might as well throw this in there. The prescription drug element of things. Why don't we just get into that a little bit? Because like you were saying, there's this tendency to think of, well, there's good drugs and then there's bad drugs, but there's not necessarily any particular drug that's inherently good or inherently bad. But do you think that, and I think it's under my conclusion that the prescription, the pharmaceutical, big pharma, it's kind of in their interest to maybe demonize these other drugs. What's your take on that whole model that's set up of big pharma and this kind of thing?
I certainly don't doubt that there is a desire to keep certain drugs from entering the market and being legal, from the side of big pharma. And I think you have seen it with cannabis, instances of pretty clear advocacy from their side against any improvement in the policy. I don't know if it applies to all drugs, and I'm not sure that Pfizer is too concerned about cocaine being illegal, but maybe I'm wrong. I just don't see it to the same degree as substances that have a medical purpose. And it just so happens that cannabis is one of relatively few drugs that actually would have a true impact on the sale of various pharmaceuticals. So I can understand, protecting their territory. It's not, it's not surprising at all. I mean, in terms of the bigger question of big pharma, I don't spend too much time opposing it. Most of the people I've noticed who do oppose big pharma tend to have misunderstandings about the drugs. They tend to really overinflate the harms. And, we need to approach this issue. I mean, we can have reasons to oppose what a company does. And in fact, there definitely are good reasons. But the idea that, ADHD was just made up out of nowhere in order to sell methylphenidate and amphetamine is not really supported. And the same applies to depression for SSRIs. Yes, there's overprescribing, but no, it's not the case that SSRIs and SNRIs and TCAs and MAOIs are not effective at all. I mean, they actually did help change in a pretty drastic way the way that we treat people. And I would much prefer to have that model than what we had before. However, at the same time, there's also the other side where when it comes to, say, depression, I would love for there to be psychedelic therapy. I would love for there to be the availability of various sort of new technologies with transcranial direct current stimulation. And there's just a lot of other potential therapies, or ketamine, which can have a role. And, so if we actually have a holistic model and have pharmaceuticals not be the only game in town, then I think any of the issues pretty much go away. It's just primarily an issue right now due to them essentially having a monopoly over the way that people are treated. Either you go to a therapist who, sort of a psychotherapist, psychologist, who's not going to prescribe something, and you might get some benefit, you might not. A lot of therapy has to do with interpersonal relationships. So the chance of you finding a good therapist to help you without a drug is not as high as we would like it to be. Mm-hmm. So drugs, specifically SSRIs or even ADHD drugs, are really the only option. So if we expanded that to include more options for treatment, I think we would be in a better situation. So that's why I'm not focused on actually opposing big pharma, but especially in the way that some people do, I think we just have to focus on the science and go wherever the science tells us. And yeah, so there are issues, but they're not as big as some people like to suggest.
Yeah, no, definitely. I would agree with that as well. It can seem kind of confusing, I think, and I think a lot of people do have this, kind of team side approach almost, where it's like, well, I'm in favor of psychedelics. I'm in favor of ayahuasca and DMT and
you're on
the
natural side or the synthetic side.
Right, exactly. So therefore, the pharmaceutical industry must be inherently evil. Whereas I think it's just, I think it's I'm more inclined to agree with you, and I think they're just functioning the way that they have to function in the certain setting that we're in right now, in the prohibitionary era that we live in. So it's, seems like they're just protecting their interests. They're doing what they know how to do.
You wouldn't expect them to be, the great thing about, having a sort of libertarian versus a sort of stereotypical conservative point of view, and not to say that conservatism is an issue, because the philosophy side of it, I don't really have an issue with. But in terms of the stereotypical Republican, that versus libertarian, it's a nice position to be in, because you can say, I want big pharma to do whatever they want, but I definitely don't want them to have a monopoly and have a lack of competitors. I definitely don't want to subsidize them or have them sort of game the system for for their benefit. And also, you don't have to feel like you're always defending a business. I can say, I hate what Pfizer did in that situation, but I don't want them to like go out of business and have all their drugs banned from the market. I mean, so there's a middle ground and a way of approaching the activity of a company, which is, sort of different than a lot of people have. Either it's always pro-business and, they can do no wrong, or on the other side, basically the businesses should collapse because they've only ever harmed people. And, surely nobody has been helped by, any of the treatments that have been offered by pharmaceutical companies. And on that side, you see such a downward spiral towards not just saying, ADHD is overblown, but saying, vaccines for anything are just totally ineffective and harmful, or, antibiotics should never be used, and things like that. And it's almost always somewhere in the middle ground that the truth of the matter actually lies. So it's nice when you don't really have to feel like you're picking a side, and you can just approach it through evidence and through sort of your own opinion. And unfortunately, when it comes to this issue, even a lot of well-meaning people on the sort of pro-cannabis or pro drug policy reform side, they often buy into a set ideology that doesn't line up with truth, and that's unfortunate to see, because it also gives the opposing side so many ways to poke holes in that argument, because they can actually point out legitimate flaws in the thinking of a anti-prohibition person when certain things are said. So, it applies to so many different areas, but the middle ground of viewing things is incredibly useful and is underutilized.
Yeah, who would have thought? Like, I mean, it makes so much sense. It just seems so reasonable. And I myself am one who I need to get pulled back into the middle ground often, because I'll have instances where I'm just like, man, I just want to like roll down the street in a pickup truck with a cauldron of ayahuasca, just dosing people, just like handing it out to everyone that I possibly can. But you gotta.
Of course, I've heard people say, if only we could give ISIS MDMA, problem solved. And right. It might be a little more confusing than that. So.
Yeah, there's a little bit more to it than that. It's a little bit more than just simply doing something like that. So your videos, TDC, the Drug Classroom, they're providing this straightforward drug education and free from bias as far as I can see. So you're really laying it out there on all sides and letting the science speak for itself. What is your experience when it comes to this stuff? Do you before you do a video, or when you're doing research, do you maybe order some chemicals, or did you?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, about a good portion of the things on the Drug Classroom I've not used. I mean, in some cases, they're not even readily available from anywhere, whether it's on the street or online. I mean, so there's certain things that, you're just not going to get access to. To some extent, that's a negative thing and maybe a positive thing. Who knows? But no, I do use some of those substances. I like to have an idea of what the drug is doing. A good example is something like MDMA. I was talking about it before I had used it, and I think the information was fine. However, once you have used a substance like that or a psychedelic, it's a bit easier to have a discussion about the substance, because you can't. There's certain things you can't put into words in the way that a certain drug feels. So having a discussion with somebody is a lot easier and relatable when you've had some sort of personal experience. So I don't really use drugs on a frequent basis, but I tend to. I find a given substance, I use it 1 to 3 times with an escalating dose, and then I just never use it again. And that tends to be the way that I approach things.
Yeah, and I would say that it seems like that you approach things from a good standpoint. I would say that we probably need more people like that to kind of directly experience something. So this way, they really have a good knowledge, a good depth and breadth of what that substance can provide, what kind of experience that can provide, along with the along with doing outside research as well. And kind of coming together for a comprehensive approach to that. So I think that tends to be pretty beneficial to do that. So is there anything you had mentioned before that you were getting more into kind of the history and how drugs could be used throughout history and civilization and things like that? Is there anything that's really currently fascinating you with maybe some information that you found out about some substances being used in history and how they've maybe helped or hurt societies?
In terms of recent stuff that was kind of in my mind because of just when I was doing the videos, the history for a few things. I mean, nitrous oxide, ibogaine, ayahuasca, and there's another one that I'm blanking on. But there are some very, the other one was absinthe, which it's really just alcohol, but absinthe is actually a good example of this. I mean, the history is incredible. I mean, there were periods of time where probably, half of the artists, I mean, this is not an actual stat, but a huge portion of artists in France and in Switzerland were using this drug and specifically feeling like it was influencing their art. And in some cases, it's actually believed that certain artists, there was one in Estonia, that it really had a true impact on a phase of his art. I mean, it was pretty much only alcohol as far as we know, but it had this huge cultural effect, and it really, it really took over. And this is where like the history gets interesting. Like in France is historically associated with wine, but for a period of time there was a crop issue in the late where were we, like the late 1800s, and it wiped out the wine crop. And then suddenly almost everybody was using absinthe, and there was like a 1,000% increase in the use of the drug. And it was and then you read what people were saying at the time, and then you also see certain bits of hysteria. I mean, some of the first laws against absinthe came because there was a guy in Switzerland who he tragically killed his wife and his daughters, and then the police and the townspeople blamed it entirely on absinthe, which he had used during that day, but he also had like wine, and he also had brandy, and he had like 3 other drinks, but they focused on absinthe, and it is so reminiscent of what you can see nowadays with drug hysteria. I mean, you can view a situation like that and be like, that is so similar to Flakka, which was alpha PVP, this drug that got a bit of attention in Florida and some other places in the past couple of years, and just that hysterical response has been around for now centuries, and always having the negative effect of influencing policy. Mm-hmm. But in terms of like the way that people have also used drugs, I mean, it's endlessly fascinating, and I have a lot of books on the subject that I need to get through on just South American use of ayahuasca, and then there's some other drugs in the area that are also used. Yopo and whatnot. But, ayahuasca has an interesting history in the way that, syncretic churches appeared in the 1900s. Syncretic churches, whether it's ayahuasca or ibogaine, it's fascinating how those appear. I mean, the idea that you have sort of this Christian influence and possibly the origins are to sort of sanctify or justify the use of the substance, but over time, it truly has become the case that these religions are like half Christian and half drug use, that nobody ever associated with Christianity before. And so, I mean, just the thing that I love about the researching when it comes to drugs is that you really see a huge impact of the entire topic area on the development of civilizations. I mean, it's not that they're the primary factor in most cases, but they certainly probably have had some impact on religious developments or just the way that certain communities function, and that remains true in parts of Africa, that remains true in South America. And so, I mean, there's a lot to learn, and I think we can also learn from those groups to see how drugs could be integrated into society and not be abused in a way that's harmful. And clearly it is possible because other groups of people have done it.
Right. Yeah. Maybe we could learn from our some of our past mistakes and kind of progress with adding the good and kind of leaving out the bad. It seems like it seems like when you look at history that there's a bit of a pattern in terms of different societies and civilizations across the globe that are springing up and having some sort of association with some kind of substance that will alter you in some way or another, whether it be tobacco or alcohol, or like you gave that great story about absinthe. And it just seems such a part of our human story to seek these things out. So people we're going to do this no matter what the laws are, no matter what the restrictions and regulations are. People have this desire to go and use something.
They do. And if there was one desire that I really had in this area, it is to, in terms of learning from other cultures, the biggest thing is finding a way to, I mean, alcohol is technically, it's within society, and we have just really screwed up our way of using it in a way that centuries ago we were not seeing to the same degree, and even in some other countries we don't see. But setting that aside, having a way for drug use to be a social activity that brings people together, I think that's the way that drug use is most useful. I mean, whether it's MDMA, which you actually do see, and a lot of people surely, I mean, you can think what you want about EDM music culture, but the fact that those people are having fun, it's a unifying experience, it really enhances certain people's lives, cannot be denied. And I think that's better than certain ways of using drugs. But this also applies to everything from kava or psychedelics. But even, we've had times in history or human history where chocolate was a communal substance to use. And I think having these things, whether it's, I'm not a fan of religion, but I don't think it can be denied that having some catalyst, whether it's drugs or religion or something of that sort, that brings people together to, engage in and discuss, and especially if you can have transformative experiences, as well as have drugs that are antidotes to certain psychological conditions, then that's a great way to have drugs be in society. But right now, we have drugs subjugated to such a great degree that they don't have the ability to really be that kind of integrated part of human activity. And it may be the case that, heroin is probably never going to be that way, but there's certain drugs that probably would, and it would be for the better. And if you had a society that was more connected around anything, but including drugs, as you often see nowadays with psychedelics in certain cultures, I think the chance of people abusing drugs, other substances, is lower. I mean, it's no surprise that the current culture in America would lend itself to people sort of on their own using drugs in a way that's negative for them and negative for their families and disconnects them from work and from other recreational activities. It's not really that surprising, but in other cultures, it happens at a lower rate.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of, having just bonding around something clearly is possible with drugs. And the fact that the drugs can provide really significant experiences in the case of psychedelics, it's not surprising that you would choose to have a society be built around that particular kind of activity. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways that drugs could be used within a society, and we're really overlooking their potential. And that's not to say, the harms are not significant in certain areas, but it's not only harms, and that's something that people tend to miss.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, you said definitely a lot of really great stuff there. I think that I think that's definitely something that we should be looking at and trying to figure out a way in how we can integrate this way of bringing people together, forming kinds of communal experiences where people can, where we can kind of maybe foster an environment that would be conducive to having a nurturing, loving, and compassionate kind of experience for people who are maybe going through something that is rough or just wanting to have some kind of ecstatic experience. I know that like you mentioned with EDM and whatnot, I definitely was getting, going to a lot of like festivals and, being a part of a crowd of people where, you could probably guess that about maybe at least half the crowd is on MDMA and other things.
Yeah.
But there is a palpable energy of communion in the air, and there's something that is very primal that connects you with everybody around you who normally would be strangers. Normally in New York City, you're walking down the street, you don't even look at people. But now you're in this pit of, 20,000 people who are all dancing together to music. There's something very primal there that connects us to each other, and it seems to offer a good, positive experience. And there's that motto that they the plur doctrine of peace, love, unity, and respect. And I can't think of anything else that would be a good, like that sounds pretty good to me. So.
And with psychedelics, I think the key thing moving forward is to look at what I consider the mistakes of the 60s generation,
right,
and finding a way to integrate psychedelics into society in a less disruptive manner, and to not kind of use them in a way to just separate yourself from the culture entirely and be, I want nothing to do with this. I'm going to go on my own internal spiritual quest. I mean, there can at times be uses for that, but I think you saw a lot of people sort of place too much emphasis on them, and they also had the impact of being disruptive in a way that everybody else in society was, I mean, not everybody, but a good portion were looking down upon that kind of activity, whereas you can see other instances of psychedelics being used, which, I mean, whether it's other cultures or just the way that, reading a book like P-Call from Alexander Shulgin,
mm-hmm.
and, him talking about, using drugs in sort of these group settings, and it was just, maybe 10 people or so, but just having them be used in that kind of way. And it's not necessarily always part of some big spiritual quest and a way to, say F you to society, but rather just something to do and have fun with and bond over. So there's certain things about the 60s that I think it sort of, a person like Tim Leary is interesting to listen to and interesting to read about due to his role in history, but I don't think that we would want necessarily a society of Timothy Leary's, and so that's why it always kind of concerns me when people And I was like this only a few years ago. But when they are approaching psychedelics in that way, in the, that kind of, this is the epitome of a way to transform and to, reach into, some cosmic perspective. And I think it has a negative effect because it really overhypes what the drugs do, and it seems to have this effect of isolating people from everybody else because they just go on their own quest. So I think some form of better integration is what we should, be engaged in. And it's not psychedelics, but with MDMA, you do see that. I mean, these people are not dropping out of society to go to these events, and they're also not necessarily transforming their lives at those events, but that's a more integrated form of drug use. It's, gathering around a place and doing it and then returning back, and not saying, that this whole process is meant to transform the way that the entire world works, like some people wanted to do and still want to do in the psychedelic culture. So I think, again, the middle ground is useful.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of hard to, when you first discover these substances and you see what the potential is for maybe human potential or for spiritual potential to be gained or whatever if you have a positive experience, it can be so tempting to think that this could be a panacea, and it's just like you just want to go out and preach like gospel to people about these things, but there's a lot of people that will just not, I think, so I got some great advice when someone told me, it's way better to invite people in, like you're having a campfire and you're inviting them in to exchange stories and ask questions, rather than, driving along the Venice Beach boardwalk with a boombox and a megaphone screaming, Jesus is our Lord and Savior,
Yeah.
It's a little bit better to kind of invite people in, ask them questions, and try and kind of figure out what the best uses and best practices are, just like we do with everything else, just the same way that we do with everything else. And I think that for me, I definitely think that it's our moral right to explore our consciousness in whichever way that we want, to alter our brain in whichever way, our minds in whichever way that we choose. That nobody should really tell you that what you can and can't put into your own body. But aside from the moral standpoint, there's several people that really advocate therapeutic, holistic uses for certain things to be, and so I think that and I kind of asked you this before, but do you think that's maybe a way to expedite kind of this integration thing? Like, do you think that offers more of a doorway into the mainstream, into integrating it into society? If we can really show that certain kinds of, I guess specifically psychedelics, or that I'm speaking about, if we can show that these can really have therapeutic value, do you think that would be a better way to kind of expedite the integration process into society?
I do think it could really have a positive effect. I mean, I forget who said it, but I think maybe it was Ethan Nadelman, who was pointing out that one of the main factors for getting somebody to view cannabis legalization, or at least medical cannabis legalization, in a positive way was knowing somebody who had benefited. So if we were to formalize a medical use of MDMA and psilocybin and LSD, and suddenly people just in the workplace or in their family knew people who actually used the drug in that way with a doctor or a psychotherapist, and it was positive and had all these clear beneficial effects, then suddenly it starts to normalize the idea of the substances. And I think that's a good tactic. I think it's been useful for cannabis, and for most likely moving forward MDMA and psychedelics. I think the downside is that it can't apply to all substances for the most part. So we're still going to be left with the people, viewing, meth in a certain way that's not particularly helpful. But I would rather have some drugs be legal than all drugs be totally prohibited. So yeah, I mean, at least in some cases, it really does help. I mean, one of the key factors for the place we're currently in is that through intentional and unintentional messaging in society, people have a lot of preconceived and incorrect views about the way that these drugs work and what they do. And in the case of something like cannabis, suddenly everybody started to realize, wait, this can be helpful for a lot of conditions. I know people who are using it. They're using it every day, and I don't notice anything negative going on with them. They're still doing all their normal work. Maybe they're even happier than before. And suddenly it's like, oh, well, okay, that seems like something we could allow into society. And if there are psychedelic therapy centers in every city, who knows if that would have the beneficial, I think it probably would, the beneficial impact of spreading the view that psychedelics and MDMA can be helpful and should be available, even if it is just in these settings, which I don't view as ideal. But again, I really want the people with PTSD to have access to MDMA. So I'll take whatever I can get when it comes to policy change.
Yeah, definitely. I'll take whatever I can get when it comes to policy change as well. And I used to do another podcast, Part of the Problem, and I guess I lean more towards the anarcho side of things. And sometimes people will go, "Oh man, you just want more statist solutions." I'm like, "Look, man, I will take what I can get. It's a game of inches as far as I'm concerned. If we can keep kind of moving that ball forward, eventually, I feel like we will get towards the goal line, like you said.
And
with cannabis, yeah,
I've noticed the same thing in my case, because there's certain sort of principles that I have tried to think through in my head, and once I've encountered them, especially for the past few years, I've not really been able to convince myself of any other position. So things like self-ownership, things like a sort of maximum level of liberty, and for me, what a sort of a maximum level of freedom and liberty in society would involve is anarcho-capitalism, because I just can't see another system that technically represents that. At the same time, however, I'm not totally convinced, and even people like David Friedman don't seem to be totally convinced that would necessarily lead to the most ideal situation. So if we can just focus on reducing the way that government is involved in things and treating taxation as theft on principle to the degree that it should always be limited as much as possible, and preferably maybe a relatively low. I mean, if the government was doing only the things that sort of, say, a minarchist sort of view of things would justify, I mean, whether it's a land value tax or a sales tax that is probably relatively low, could possibly fund the government, and I would be much happier with that system, even if it is still technically theft is still occurring in society, based on that principle. I would much prefer that. So I do, and I think even, I heard Jason Stapleton recently, who does another sort of libertarian podcast, expressing that point of view. I think he was on Dave Rubin, saying, let's focus on the things that can change, things like police overreach and prohibition, and, move in those areas. And before we even get into this infighting and disagreement about going one step further and two steps further, just get through those things to move in that positive direction. And that's why I'm on that side versus the, blow up the system and try and, institute anarcho-capitalism,
Right.
which I don't think is realistically ever going to happen. But we could make positive change. And saying that positive change is not useful unless we're 100% the way that the most idealistic people would want seems a little bit silly. And you're going to miss out on a lot of freedom-centric benefits that you could have within the society if you are always focused on that and never willing to compromise on any deal. So, and in prohibition, that kind of, works. When a state wants to, decriminalize cannabis, I'm not going to say, no, don't do that because legalization entirely is the only way to go. No, I would love for people not to go to jail anymore. So,
Right.
we can move, step by step and go in this direction. And we don't have to have, the libertarian society that I want in 5 years. It can take longer. Let's just move in that direction. And you're going to find a lot of people actually get on board with that kind of message. When people are no longer trying to institute a utopia, then you can actually, make positive changes while recognizing, this is the biggest problem that people seem to have when it comes to sort of libertarian principles is that, people think, I guess some people do approach libertarianism as a utopia, but it's not really how I do. Look at, this individual issue that would not be dealt with under that kind of system. Well, okay, either maybe we could find a way to deal with that through, a lot of times private means, but maybe in a sort of minarchist system, we could justify some, there's something huge going on and you could justify some sort of regulation in that very specific area because it's this very atypical situation that can't be dealt with otherwise. Or we can, in most cases, just recognize that a certain level of negative things in society are going to exist.
Right.
We just need to move in the way that's most positive, instead of trying to the bar always being set at everybody has everything they want, because that's not it's not reasonable. So
Right.
any sort of utopian view, the end goal of Marxist, view, that kind of stuff, I just can't get on board with, and I can't get on board with it on the right or the left, wherever we are. It's just not likely to occur, and it's too high of a standard. But we can make positive change, and that's the great thing about it.
You mean we can't? No, you mean not everybody could have equal, fair? Like not everyone could be these perfect, equal. Everything's Yeah, I completely agree. I don't know where I was trying to make some kind of funny metaphor or something like that. But yeah, I mean it's just this silly idea that we could just force everyone to be happy and equal and fair and everything. And it's like, look, of course that would be great, but we live in reality where these things are a lot harder. And my thing is, look, I love the idea, the principles of liberty and libertarianism, and I do lean more towards the anarcho-capitalist side of things. So in that kind of society, if we can inch the ball further towards that, then we can start to see less regulation, less laws, less restrictive policies, and we can allow for more freedom to happen where we can see competition and we can see a battle of ideas kind of take place, and maybe even secession into smaller units where we can organize among like-minded people or something like that. But the point is, let's at least allow people to have the freedom to test theories, to put things to the test, and let's use data to come up with what's the best way to organize society. What are the best ways to make sure that we have a group of people that are living to the best possible ability that they can live to. And I always say to people who favor more of a socialist thing, I'm like, hey, look, under a libertarian society, you can go and you can try your socialist thing as long as it's voluntary. But oftentimes what happens is they find out it doesn't really work that well.
Or maybe, I mean, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that within this sort of very freedom-centric environment that you would have small communes of people who could live the way that they want to. I mean, there are certain people who will, to the day that they die, feel as though ever working for somebody, because you have to work in order to get money, to get food, and therefore you have to work to live, and that means that you're a slave of McDonald's. I mean, people make that jump which I'm not sure what they think real slavery is,
Mm-hmm.
but, or not realizing that you do realize that, I mean, are you going to say that you're sort of a slave to nature because in the absence of money to get food, you would have to spend your entire day doing these things to get food. So therefore, Mother Earth is a terrible monster. So I mean, you'll have those people who have that very strict view of it's all oppression all the time whenever a company is involved. And okay, there probably will be enough money for you to set up on a piece of land a commune that works. And in my opinion, the general idea of anything that's more socialist or communist works on that level. It doesn't work on 7 billion people, but
Right.
It might work on 250. And if you're one of those 250, you have a place to go. I mean, that's fine. There's no issue with that. Nobody will ever try to stop, that from happening.
Right.
Whereas if you go down the communist route, suddenly, what if under the communist system that's being implemented, I ever wanted in some way to have an exchange that was sort of not equal, and I wanted to set up a contract with somebody, like that becomes this illicit thing because it starts to institute something that undermines the communist system. So it only works when every single person is on board, which you're never going to get. You're never going to have everybody on board to that degree. And that's, I think, the folly of the system. So, but obviously, luckily, we're far away from either of those being, reality. We're probably not going to have anybody really try to implement, communism in the United States. I mean, who knows? But, I think it's a low chance.
For sure. I mean, yeah, they definitely like to favor more kind of nationalist, socialist kinds of policies, at least in this administration. Yeah.
True. And it's often despicable. But I do think it's important. I think there's been a lack of, when I kind of think about what I was learning in school when it came to history, I think there was a lack of discussion about communism. I mean, we really should be learning about what are the true ideological goals of Marx or those who espoused fascism, and what were the results, as far as we can tell, when that tries to be implemented. And I think you'll get more people to realize that although there are a lot of flaws in the, so-called free market system of the US, that it's a better option than what those systems accomplished. Mm-hmm. And of course, you always get the response that the Soviet Union and Cuba and, North Korea and China were never really communist. Well, yeah, they weren't. They didn't get necessarily to the Marx goal, but I don't think that the Marx goal is possible. That's kind of the reason it didn't go in that direction.
I laugh at that because it's like, well, we never really established true communism. It's like, yeah, how many people have to die before we actually establish quote unquote true communism to find out?
Whereas on the other side, the second, we all now know that if you start on the path of communism, it comes with at least a handful, and I think we can all agree, of negative effects on society. Whereas the second that you move on this other direction, you start to have an increase in freedom, an increase in living standards, and a sort of better form of just living in general. I mean, I would rather have everybody, there be a form of inequality within society than have everybody within the equivalent of poverty, because it's equal. I mean, like, equal is not inherently good. I'd rather have there be a ladder during which, some people at any given time may indeed be in a very low income bracket. And that's terrible. And we should, if possible, preferably through private means, try and alleviate the most negative effects of that. But I would take that over, what seems to be guaranteed by communism. So, even though we don't have, it's kind of like saying, we don't technically ever have just pure free market capitalism either, but even just the degree to which we do, it's positive. So, you can at least compare those things, inadequate communism versus inadequate capitalism. I'm choosing the inadequate capitalism any day.
Mm-hmm.
And there's countries that have actually gone through that process, and everybody from those countries seems to pretty much be on board. So it's unfortunate when you see people that swing in the other direction and say it's all oppression and it all has to be, torn down and we have to go back to Marx. And maybe that does come from a lack of history education. I think there's a lot to be gained from understanding, these ideologies. They didn't appear out of nowhere. So we need to learn, 19th and 20th century history and ideology. It's quite helpful. And maybe people would understand what's going on instead of just saying the banks are bad. So, they all need to be, the entire economic system has to now be controlled by the government. It's like, wait. I mean, I think there's a problem. We've identified it, but that kind of solution it goes down a path that you really don't want to go down on. And we have enough evidence for it. So, yeah, it's not directly related to drugs, but I do think at the core of this is just the freedom principle. I want, when I'm standing here right now, talking with you, if I had a drug in front of me, there should be no issue with me picking it up and taking it. There should not be the police coming in to arrest me. There's also shouldn't be the police coming in to arrest me if somebody comes through my door and I decide, hey, I think, the drug classroom would be better if I actually set it up as a company and I was hiring somebody. But I'm going to pay you, I can't afford too much right now, but I'm going to, try and help you as much as I can. And I'm going to pay you $4 an hour and do that to a number of people. That shouldn't be illegal. And we need to understand that. And nor should it be if I made the despicable decision that, somebody, who comes through and, say it was something that, and this is where some people will start to depart from my views, but, that a black person came through. This would never happen in my life because I couldn't care less about who I'm hiring. But if somebody really is out there who doesn't want to hire a person based on that reason, I understand why that's a despicable thing, but I don't think you can actually, on principle, find a way for this to be outlawed in the way that it is. Mm-hmm. So if it's a government function that is discriminating against people, that's horrible. The legal system discriminating against people, that's horrible. But when it comes to a company interacting with somebody to hire them or to sell them a product, that I don't think you need to force those interactions. And I think, that's a full implementation of the policy or the principle. And if the worst thing that happens in this current, society is once in a while somebody can't get a cake baked for them, or they can't, one, racist employer said, no, get out of here. I'm not going to hire you. We don't need to rewrite the entire legal system to address that. So, I think that's where, I lose some people, but I think we can deal, like when I was saying before that a utopia isn't the goal, that would be an instance of that. A utopia would be everybody's not racist and everybody's hiring everybody and everybody is, never discriminating when it comes to pay. And that would be awesome. And you should put pressure on companies to do that. But you don't probably need legislation to mandate certain interactions, just for the, in the name of trying to move towards a utopia. And especially when it comes to certain policies that could have negative effects. I mean, there's probably not really too many negative effects when it comes to, somebody was fired for sexist reasons. If that legislation was in there to say that that's wrong, there's probably not negative effects. But on something like minimum wage, there may actually be negative effects. So there's even more reasons to consider that policy carefully. And I just, it would be nice, in my opinion, to just have a certain, realm of principles pertaining to self-ownership, and then that also applying to your money. And you can do what you want with your money, including hire people. And, implementing those policies, I think, does more good than bad. And I would rather have a government based on principles, which seemed to be what we were trying to get at with the Constitution, even if it turned out to fail. because we are far from it.
Yeah.
And far from what I think you could say was being argued in those in the Bill of Rights. But that idea of, hey, we have this document here which lays out a very clear set of things that the government won't do to its people. That's awesome. And that, having some level of principle instead of just constantly, everything is up for vote and whatever people want goes. I don't think that's really a great idea.
No, I agree with you 100%. I think if we can inject the principles of liberty and freedom and self-ownership and private property into the consciousness of the mainstream culture more, then that would allow for more. That would actually allow for more kind of more a little bit more peace, a less of a fear-based approach. You kind of leave people to their own devices as long as they're not harming anybody else. What difference does it make? I love this Terrence McKenna quote where he says, "If the words life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness don't include the right to experiment with your own consciousness, then the Declaration of Independence isn't worth the hemp it was written on."
Exactly.
And yeah.
And right now, one of the biggest issues that people are talking about is a potentially disproportionate level of violence towards minorities, specifically African Americans. And this is all coming from, this has spawned Black Lives Matter, and it's understandable why there's a focus on this issue. But I think if we could focus on, if that kind of movement was totally focused on drug legalization and getting rid of, probably certain traffic laws. I mean, like, certain drunk driving laws and the way that they're implemented, like stopping people randomly to see if they're drunk. Yeah, no, that's not good. And then prostitution, get rid of those, and the number of interactions between police, the size of the police force. These things would be addressed to a significant degree just by improving the laws. Not too many people are saying F the police in a situation where the police are only going after murderers and rapists and people who stole things, and you also reduce the need for patrol. So, if we were focused on that versus, race, and it's not wrong to point out that, a group is affected more there, but, it sort of suggests that if only there were more shootings of white people and more stops of white people, that everything would be okay. No, the issue is the police using force in these situations where they shouldn't. So focus on the police militarization, focus on the principle at hand, and I think we could all, you would see more people on the right who would get behind that, especially the more libertarian right, and get behind that idea if it was approached in that way, instead of talking about, these other social justice issues. Not to say that they all are false or should not be focused on at all, but if you're going to have a campaign, I think focusing on a principle is much more unifying across party lines and across groups of people than you currently see with this situation, where a lot of people are just looking at, the issue of Black Lives Matter and saying, I don't like that at all, and therefore I'm just going to stand behind the police entirely. And no, that was not effective. You just led to more people saying that they're totally fine with the police, whereas if you were saying, hey, these seem to be like way too many interactions between people who are doing nothing, both white, black, Latino, whatever, and then suddenly getting killed or being arrested or just being harassed. And that's where the greatest disparities seem to be, not necessarily in shootings of black people, but especially in the amount of stops that affect them and the interactions that affect them, even if they're not lethal. That's just wrong. If you're driving down the street and you've done nothing, you should not be stopped. Or if you're walking down the street, you should not be stopped. And that's a principle that we really need to get behind. And it would be nice if that was the way that people were approaching the issue. In my opinion, of course, this is coming, in the current climate of identity politics. It's coming from a white, cis, cisgender whatever male.
Oh my God,
so
a white cisgender male. Don't listen to him, folks.
So I might not have any, leg to stand on, but that's my honest view of the situation. I have a lot of sympathy for what these people are fighting for, but I do think there's a way to tweak it and focus on the principle, because those kinds of principles also line up with what a lot of people were saying in the late 1700s. And if we could realize that would be pretty impressive. If we could all stand behind principles that were being espoused in terms of liberty and freedom that were coming from at least some people within the, the early American, the colonies and then the government, that'd be awesome. I'd be way more in favor of that. You would probably see me protesting in the street if we were actually, fighting for those specific rights. We took a different turn, unfortunately, as a society temporarily, and that's not a great thing. And you definitely are not going to see any Tea Party, Freedom Caucus people who are going to align themselves with Black Lives Matter. But if you were focused on the sort of principles of liberty, you may actually get people on that side of the discussion who are agreeing with the people who would otherwise be talking about Black Lives Matter, because it becomes a principle of freedom. And, and that's what's so powerful about that argument as well. And if you just, if people could just have a freedom bias, there's so many benefits to that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think what happens is oftentimes good ideas or good labels or something that sounds good on the outside, Black Lives Matter, right? Of course they matter. Well, who wouldn't say that they don't matter? But if, it's like this hijacking of this word or this phrase, and then using it to tug on people's heartstrings to get them wrapped up in this emotional nonsense of words and language and this and that. But also, like you said, if we had more people rooted in the ideas of freedom, and this is more of a principle of liberty issue, that we could see how it all ties in. A cop stops a guy on the side of the road. He's a black guy. He searches his car. Maybe he finds a little bit of weed or something. All of a sudden now it's a national incident because the cop shoots him, and then you have half the country saying, well, this guy's a black gangster and he deserved what he got because he was a drug guy. He had drugs in his car, and that's the end of that, and we're going to support the police because they protect us. And then you have the other half of the country, Black Lives Matter, saying, look at this epidemic. Police just shoot people. So it's like, well, isn't it a little bit more new? Like, shouldn't we think a little bit deeper? Shouldn't we think about the ideas of liberty and freedom a little bit? Why is this guy being stopped? Why is it not okay that he has a little bit of marijuana? Who is he harming? And what is this drug war actually doing to help us? What are the statistics? Where's the evidence that people are being helped and saved and liberated? There is none. There is none. It's just this, this mindless war.
And there's a lot of talking points when it comes to being anti-prohibition, and obviously we can focus on freedom, but we can also focus on public health, because legal heroin is countless times safer than prohibited heroin. It's just a fact. There's no toxicologist or pharmacologist informed about the issue who would ever disagree with that. And so, there's a public safety argument. There's also an argument when it comes to how it impacts police relations. It also comes down to, what about all of the source countries? What about South America? What about Afghanistan?
Right.
What does this, and Central America, what does this drug trade do to people? I would rather have some people who have, some Christian conservative considers a drug addict to be immoral and they're sinning. I'd rather have, even if I agreed with that, I'd rather have people who were sinning and ruining their own lives than totally innocent people in, 8-year-olds in, favelas being killed.
Mm-hmm.
I would pick, the addicts, some more addicts over way fewer deaths and way less crime in those other countries, because we're not even talking about drug users who are being hurt by prohibition. We're actually talking about people who had nothing to do with it. So, and this is actually the argument that Milton Friedman brought up at some point, saying that, you can have like compassion for the drug addict, but even more so when it comes to just an innocent person in, Mexico or El Salvador or other areas in South America who was just killed as a result of the gang cartel violence, which is spawned entirely by the existence of a black market. So once you realize the actual scope of this issue and the way that it impacts people and ruins lives, then there are so many arguments in favor of prohibition. But unfortunately, a lot of people really restrict the argument to just focusing on people in the U.S. as though, all of the growing and the selling and the transportation occurs within the U.S. It doesn't. It has a huge global negative impact that actually contributes to political and government instability and a complete abolishment of so much potential human productivity because of the way that these groups, which are funded to a significant degree by illicit drugs, are sort of messing with the local populace. And if we actually expand the view of how prohibition impacts the world, I think it becomes such a no-brainer that that you would want a different policy.
Right. Yeah. It's almost like if you take that example I gave of the individual being stopped in the car by the police officer and projected on a macro scale, you're looking at the same kind of thing that's happening with our culture in the way that we maybe dehumanize and demonize, maybe people, brown-skinned people that are making cocaine in Colombia. Oh, these are some evil people with guns and they're bad guys and they're going to kill people.
That's how we've been talking about it. I mean, not we figuratively, but right. That's how it's been discussed for so long, is associating, and it's not purely driven by racism, but a lot of the drug laws, at least started in some kind of racist viewpoint and in a stereotyping and finding a way to, you can't just go around, arresting people for, being, black, but you definitely could if you could identify an activity they're engaging in that people, could conceivably think is wrong. And then voila, you have the current situation. And it's not that it's continued to be an issue because of clear, widespread racism, but it definitely has roots in that. And it certainly contributed to the way that people view different groups of people because, maybe they are more affected by certain drugs because of the communities they're in, or because of the way that these things were talked about in the media for a long time. So, I mean, there's a lot of insidious and sort of less overt ways in which the policy of prohibition has contributed to larger societal issues, which are frequently overlooked.
Right. Yeah, and it seems to be, really education and access to information to educate yourself about these kinds of things. And I think that we're starting to see a change happen. I mean, ever since really the internet has spread and allowed for a mass of people to have access, that at least now the options are out there. I like this quote that I've been hearing, in the age of information, ignorance is a choice. And I think to some degree that's true, but on some degree it is a part of the society's responsibility in order to educate the youth who are coming up in the society to the true nature of the world and the true nature of let's say like these substances that you speak about, and how the true history of things. And so in a way it's kind of our fault for not us, but humanity before us that dropped the ball and didn't really and didn't properly educate people in terms of this stuff. So I think really what we do need is we need more people out there like you that are providing this kind of education. So when people come to the drug classroom, .com, and they see your videos, I see they're all on YouTube as well, and you have a bunch of subscribers on YouTube, and you have them on your website. What are you hoping for people to get out of this experience and learn from coming to the TDC, drugclassroom.com?
I'm really hoping that I mean, obviously it's based around learning things. I hope in a lot of cases it will dispel certain incorrect beliefs that people have. So if somebody who is not actually trying to use drugs, they're just, say like alpha PVP was a drug that was being talked about recently in the news, and they go and I don't know if I actually did a video on it, but they go and they find, information there, they see the video, and it can actually serve to, tamp down the hysteria about it and just educate about where did this drug actually come from? Here's what it's doing in the brain. Here's what the safety is. And it's really not as bad as some people made it out to be. In the other situation, you have people who are actually wanting to use drugs, and they have an interest in using the substance in a safe way. They have no desire to go out and, use MDMA or use LSD or use, even cocaine or methamphetamine in a way that's going to permanently damage them for the future. Nobody makes that. If you give somebody, here's one way to use cocaine and it's safe, here's another way to use cocaine and it's not safe, I'm not aware of too many non-suicidal people who are going to pick option two. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, people are only presented with option two in the current paradigm. And with the drug classroom, I hope it provides option one. Okay, you're going to do the drug. Hopefully if you're, 15 or 16, you hold off, you have your entire life. If you're really interested in using drugs, you have your entire life to use drugs, and it's going to cause you most likely fewer problems if you wait until 20 than doing it at 16. But for everybody, especially over 18 or so, who is interested, here are the things. Don't combine it with this. Take 30 milligrams. You're going to be fine, unless you don't, do, if you had a recent, schizophrenia diagnosis, stay away from LSD because we don't know clearly what the association is. So just don't bother. Don't do it. But, so explaining in a non-judgmental, unbiased way, who should be safe in which situations, how to be safe in which situations. And I think, I hope that so far it's had a positive impact on the way that people use drugs, because one of the best ways to demonize drugs is to have more and more articles in the news of, 15-year-old tragically enters coma because of insert drug. If I could in any way over the course of the drug classroom reduce even 1% the rate at which those articles appear because of people use the drug in a safe way, I would be incredibly happy.
Nice. Yeah, that sounds like a good goal to have. And do you worry at all about the maybe crackdown on the internet, maybe restricting free speech and things like that? I had noticed that I think that the state would like to get their hands on control of information. And I do have a slight little worry in the back of my mind that maybe they will try ramping up control over what gets put out there. What do you think about that? We're talking about the freedom and the freedom to have education with these videos is something that I see as a necessity as time moves on and people get more informed and we start to integrate them into the culture. So the use to have an outlet for education on these things is very important. I would hate to see some kind of internet crackdown and freedom crackdown essentially to obstruct that. Do you worry about that at all, or what do you think about that?
I don't really worry about a crackdown in terms of freedom, which would mean, the government passes some sort of law that is restrictive towards what ISPs can show or something like that, and then suddenly you need a VPN to get around, and nobody's going to do that. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's the case. I don't think we're moving in Chinese, internet, firewall direction. But and this is less of an issue on principle. I do think there's always the possibility for YouTube to say, we're not putting your videos, we're not going to let them be on the platform anymore. And that actually happened once. The entire channel was terminated, and which had me worried. That was in like April of last year, so about a year ago. And luckily, I talked with somebody there and got it back. But just in case, I set up the website. I set up a Vimeo account and put all the videos there. So, that should not be an issue. So, and that's not a free speech issue. It's never really a case of actual censorship. I would never, I might complain about, having the videos taken down if they were, but I don't view it as, anti-free speech, on that kind of principle. But that's the only level of potential issue that I am usually concerned about.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I noticed that YouTube was cracking down, and I saw like some on a restricted mode. It seemed that they, kind of like a Google filter search or something like that. But yeah, I think that this is good information. To have out there. So yeah, look, I guess we're in the process of kind of always having that little kind of tug and pull in terms of what people are wanting to be exposed to or allowing in society and that sort of thing. But overall, I think it's a good thing that we have educational outlets out there for people. So please, tell people where they can find you. Again, the Drug Classroom, or as you call it, TDC, the Drug Classroom.com, right? That's like the go-to place to go, where you're giving drug education, because, like you said, people are going to be. These drugs are out there. People are going to be using them, so it really only makes sense that we, educate them free from any sort of skewed, propagandistic way in terms of, educating people on these drugs in a real non-biased approach and an objective approach, and giving people the information they deserve to have about these things. So I'll let you kind of tell people where they can find you, where they can follow you. You mentioned also your podcast. I know we didn't really get to talk a little bit about that, but if you want to mention that briefly, mention that as well.
Sure. So the Drug Classroom content is primarily found on the drugclassroom.com. That's where, you can find links to the videos, you can find links to podcasts, and I also do, for those of you who are sort of more interested in the science or sort of more details about drugs, I also do overviews of individual studies, so make it a little bit easier for people to understand. And so there's a bunch of information there on YouTube, which is just for the videos. It's also the Drug Classroom. And then you can find on Facebook, the Drug Classroom, and on Twitter, it's just Drug Classroom. And then for my personal Twitter, it is Seth A. Fitzgerald. And yeah, I think that's about it. And the podcast is the Addictive Podcast. And I'm on some of the episodes and not on other ones. It's just, depends on what we're talking about. And that one is a bit more focused on sort of addiction and therapy. So it's a bit of a different topic. Occasionally we'll talk about drug education. But a lot of it is therapy. And I plan on starting a different podcast for the Drug Classroom in the relative near future. I don't know exactly when, so be on the lookout for that.
Cool, yeah, and I also see that you have a Patreon page here as well. So if people want to support you, they can go to your Patreon, right?
Yeah, so, and that's also the Drug Classroom. And yeah, everything that I do with the website or with the videos, it's all supported by donations. There's no ads involved in anywhere. So it's just donation based, and I plan on keeping it that way. So if you happen to check out the content and find it's useful and want to help more come out, then I definitely appreciate the support.
Excellent. Yeah, no, definitely. If you guys go over to thedrugclassroom.com, check out all of Seth's work. It's really tremendous. These videos are very, very detailed. They're presented very well. They're labeled properly, and there's an in-depth analysis into pretty much everything that you could think of. I mean, just looking at some of the ones, 2-FMA, nitrous oxide, DOB, DMT. I probably can't even pronounce some of these. They're out of my realm, but that's I definitely care about this sort of stuff, and I'm glad that there's people out there like you that are making this happen and providing this much needed education to all of us. And Seth, I really enjoyed this conversation. I really enjoyed your comments, not just on drugs but on freedom and liberty and everything, because I really do think it all comes together as a whole as well. So everybody go check out Seth's work and at thedrugclassroom.com. And thanks for listening to this episode. Talk to you next time.